Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for finding the time to join us today for our monthly webinar. My name is Annie Pettit and I am the Chief Research Officer at Peanut Labs, a company that specializes in providing self-serve and full-serve research samples. You can always find our full listing of webinars on the Peanut Labs website under the resources menu. We will also be recording this webinar, so if you have to leave early, no worries, we've got you covered. Today I would like to welcome a special guest. Paul Fairie is a data scientist and the founder of Centrality Data Science. He's also an instructor at the University of Calgary where he teaches several different political science courses including comparative government, how to predict an election, and research methods. I love following him on Twitter where his username is very cute. It's PaulySci. In today's webinar, Paul will be talking about the reliability of political polling for predicting elections. If you have any questions along the way, do feel free to type them into the question box at the side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can at the end of the webinar. So at this point, I will hand over the reins to Paul. Welcome, Paul.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this. I'm always happy to chat to people about data and politics. So as Annie mentioned, I'm a political scientist and a data scientist based in Calgary. I got my PhD a couple of years ago from the U of C, and since then I've been doing a little bit of teaching at the university, but otherwise mostly been involved with my company, Centrality Data Science, and we do sort of research analytics and that sort of thing. But what I really want to talk to you today, about today is basically the most fun thing I've ever done in my life, which is last year I was asked by the Globe and Mail to run their Globe election forecast, and I certainly said yes right away, because predicting elections is fun. I mean, other than just sort of the game aspect, there's lots of research questions that you can answer by trying to set up a model. So I was in charge of the model, and there was a team of 5 of us who built the Globe Election Forecast tool. And so what this tool did was it took a number of inputs and tried to generate a forecast of what the election would be. So this put me into really close contact with public political polls on a daily basis. So we'd take the latest polls, we put them into the model, and it would spit out the probability of winning each seat individually. There was a fun little game that you could sort of play where you could simulate a given election, given the sampling error associated with the polls and the results of the polls and all this sort of thing. But that's not really the main purpose of today. Today is about talking about one of the things that I was sort of constantly in fear of the entire election. It's that polls and political polls and public political polls particularly are pretty problematic. So I'll tell you about 3 of the things that kept me up at night during this last election campaign. So there are really 3 big problems. So one is that there have been, in the last few years, a number of relatively prominent polling failures where not just one polling firm and not just one poll, but dozens of polls and dozens of polling firms got the wrong results. So I mean, here in Alberta, I'm based in Calgary, everyone is still traumatized by the 2012 Alberta election, where 22 polls said that the Wild Rose would win, and what do we do when we sit down on election night? We see that the Wild Rose did not win. The same thing happened in BC in 2013 in the Michigan primary. We'll also talk a little bit about how sampling voters is actually hard. It's different from sampling a population because you're not just trying to get a random sample of people, you're trying to get a random sample of voters. And a lot of problems with polls come when you apply a likely voter model to them. And finally, we'll talk about the problem of voters essentially lying. I mean, we can be a bit brasher and say that they're lying. We can say that they're being a little bit uncomfortable, revealing their actual preferences, whatever you want. But it is really a big problem. We'll talk about some of the manifestations of that. And why do we need to care about this? It's not just that polling is sometimes wrong and we want to get as good data as possible. It's that huge polling failures often reduces the public's confidence in the value of research and science and the scientific method and random sampling and statistics. And I mean, really the best example of that was the 2015 Alberta election, which the NDP won in what was emotionally for a lot of people quite a huge surprise. And what you had was a ridiculous situation of the last 3 weeks of the campaign were filled with polls showing that the NDP would win a majority government. They were leading by 15%. They were going to win seats, a dozen seats in Calgary. They were going to sweep Edmonton. And literally, almost nobody believed this because everyone was still remembering how terrible the polling was in 2012. So getting it wrong is really the worst case scenario. Certainly as someone who was running a relatively public exercise in forecasting an election, my forecasts were basically quite reliant on the polls not being wrong. So I lived in fear then of the 2012 Alberta election repeating itself. So I mean, a really recent example just from March was the result in Michigan for the Democratic primary. So here we have a situation where public polls released in the last few days of the campaign were showing Hillary Clinton with, a 20-ish, maybe a bit more meager, maybe 11-point lead over Bernie Sanders. And we sit down on election night, and what do we see? We see that Bernie Sanders has won a huge surprise victory. And this really, again, undermines confidence. I mean, in BC, you had a bunch of polls showing that the NDP was going to sweep the Liberal Party out of power in the provincial election there, and what you have, you end up with a Liberal majority. I mean, there was a huge headline a couple of weeks before the election about how the NDP leader, I think, could commit various crimes and still win the election, and here we have nothing of the sort. And I mean, really, the best example I think is right here in Alberta. 2012 election, 22 polls, every single one showed the Wildrose lead. They were between 2 and 17% in the lead. There was an average lead in these 22 polls of almost 10% for the Wildrose. And then we have election night where the PCs win by almost 10% themselves. So a huge difference in the reality of polling versus the reality of, let's just call it actual reality. But what could we have seen if we looked a little bit closer in the polls was, as much as there were pretty big Wildrose leads, we also had this number, which was sort of lurking at the bottom in the fine print of a lot of public releases for polls. That was, most of the polls were showing a 20, sometimes even 30% of voters who were undecided. And how do polls generally treat undecided voters? They usually report the undecided number somewhere, but I mean, not all of them do. But they also then say, well, what about just decided voters? And if you eliminate undecided voters and just sort of distribute them proportionally to the parties as decided voters go, what you're actually doing, and I think it's sort of hidden in people's minds, is making the assumption that undecided voters are similar to decided voters. And we know very much so that they're not. And if you looked at other polls taken after the election, people who were deciding in the last few days weren't really thinking, oh, I really want to maybe vote Wildrose in the same proportion as everyone else. They were hesitant to vote PC because the PCs by that point had been in power for about 40 years at that point. So what they were thinking was, do I really want to re-elect the PC government? And what they did in the last few days was they split very heavily, 65, 70% of them to the PCs. And if we had had this 24% number in our minds throughout the campaign, it might have been less of a surprise that the Wildrose had won. So really, the failure of polls when they fail as spectacularly as they did in Alberta and BC and Michigan is less so a failure of sampling methods, I would say, as underemphasizing the huge role of undecided voters and the fact that undecided voters can be very different from decided voters. There's also the question of sampling voters, and where this comes in becomes a difficult exercise is that voters are not the same as the population. Because if the population and the voting population were demographically similar, were preferentially similar, it wouldn't really matter too much. But it turns out that they're not. We know that there's a gender gap in voting. There's a huge age gap in voter participation. There's an income gap. There's an education gap. So you really have to figure out how to find a likely voter. So usually there's some sort of pardon me, some sort of likely voter model. So it involves questions about self-reported past behavior, questions about how interested or engaged they are in a campaign, and even some of them use questions about demographics, so they'll discount younger voters when reporting their likely voter model. And in a lot of cases, especially in the 2012 presidential election, it turned out that polling firms who were more favorable to Mitt Romney, not politically so much as just in their results, were using likely voter models that said that voter turnout amongst demographic groups will be the same as it was in 2008 and 2004, whereas in reality what the Obama campaign was able to do was turn out voters who were less likely to vote traditionally. So likely voter models completely missed this. So some firms, I believe Gallup was one of them, had it basically tied in the last few days, whereas it turned out Obama ended up winning by 4 or 5 percentage points and quite comfortably in the Electoral College. So again, what ends up happening is likely voter models miss the possibility of demographic and voter turnout change. So I mean, a good statistic to always remember is that when you ask people whether or not they voted, 25% of people who didn't vote report having voted. And these are based on studies where in some states in the U.S., voter turnout rolls are public information, so you can double check whether a respondent to a survey is actually telling you something that is concordant with the truth. So what you end up with then is about 25% of people who didn't vote saying that they voted, so that you also get this in terms of likely voter models. So there are lots of people who say, oh yes, I'm definitely likely to vote, who don't turn out to vote and end up skewing the results when you apply a likely voter model. And last is this idea that voters aren't always telling the truth. There are lots of examples where poll respondents won't reveal the truth about whether or not they voted. And it's almost always the case that people who didn't vote will say they vote. There's apparently a pretty consistent 1% of people who actually voted who will deny having voted, and I'm not exactly sure what they're on about, but you know, the world is a diverse place, and lots of people have different preferences and life goals, I guess. But there is this group of voters who will say that they voted when they haven't. And there's also a group of voters who will have a preference that they won't end up revealing to a pollster. So who reports having voted when in reality they didn't actually vote? It turns out, well, before the study in 1986 by Silver, Anderson, and Abramson, there was the assumption that either people were lying sort of randomly, or that people who were less well educated were more likely to say that they voted when they hadn't. And it turns out most studies say that this isn't true at all. It turns out that the people who report having voted when they hadn't actually done so are highly educated people and people who have a sense of voting as a personal duty. So it's basically makes the likely voter models inaccurate because it really the likely voter models really overestimate who is going to vote. So they say, oh, highly educated people are likely to vote, but it's only because they say that they voted, as opposed to the fact that highly educated people are more likely to vote in the way that likely voter models generally presume. So what you have is a situation where if you were applying a likely voter model to a poll before releasing the results, you're really overemphasizing already overemphasized groups overrepresented groups. You're overrepresenting them, even more so than they should be if you're reflecting reality. And the reason behind highly educated people and people who have a sense of voting as an important duty, saying that they voted when they actually hadn't, goes to sort of this idea of social acceptability, that people are uncomfortable revealing that they've violated some sort of social norm. So if you're a highly educated person, you're more likely to have highly educated friends who are more likely to have at least reported having voted. So you feel like, oh, I've let down my education, my educational class group by saying that I haven't voted. Or if you grew up with voting as a sense of duty, you're saying, oh, I violated my own personal sense of duty, so I have to say that I voted when in fact I haven't actually done so. So that's one problem. So this is just the problem of people saying that they voted when they didn't. There's a whole series of other problems which have a whole host of names about where there are certain contexts, which are often quite uncomfortable, where voters tend to misreport, let's say, who it turns out that they voted for or who they're going to vote for. So that one famous example was the 1992 UK general election. Basically, the Labour Party, after years of Margaret Thatcher's rule, John Major took over a couple of years before, had said the Labour voters were going to win the election, but it turned out that there was a small group, about 4 or 5% of Conservative voters, who felt like it was socially unacceptable to say that they were going to re-elect the Conservative government. So they said they were going to vote Labour. This skewed the polls, and then on election night, the Conservatives won another majority. There's also Flora syndrome, which is their sort of Canadian version of this. Flora MacDonald was, if you remember, a Canadian progressive conservative MP who was running for the leadership, and lots of people said, oh, I like Flora MacDonald. I'm going to vote for her for PC leader. And it turned out that very few of these people did. And the idea was that people felt it was socially more acceptable to be a progressive and say, I'm going to vote for a female leader in the context of the 1970s. But then in reality, they didn't. The Bradley effect is very similar. 1982 California gubernatorial election, an African-American candidate was leading the entire time. And then it turned out there was a small percentage of voters who were actually secretly uncomfortable with the idea of electing an African-American in the early 1980s. So they sort of hid their vote and said, oh, I'm going to vote for them, when in reality they voted for his opponent. So basically there are some contexts in which voters end up misrepresenting, lying, who they're going to vote for in the election, and it's all about sort of social acceptability. I think there are actually gentler examples of this as well. The 2012 Alberta election that I talked about, there was the idea that was going around in 2012 that, maybe 41 years was enough time in power for the Alberta Progressive Conservatives. Maybe it's time for a change. Oh, it looks like the Wild Rose is the most popular change party. So what I'm going to say is that I'm going to vote for the Wild Rose, but secretly end up voting for the PCs, just out of the idea of fitting into social norms. So that's a harder one to solve, I think, but it's a context which is really important, that when there is an election where there seems to be sort of a social clustering around a certain outcome, we have to make sure to interpret polls in the context of the election that they occur in. So we'll talk a little bit about a couple of solutions that people have come up with for these three problems. So one is essentially modesty. And I know that public polling is often an exercise in self-promotion, and I recognize all of this. I mean, I run a small research firm as well, and I mean, it's an important thing to do. But selling a single poll as really dramatic or really exciting might end up getting you a few more web clicks, but it can end up sort of overselling just the results of one poll. And even just as a viewer of polls, don't get too excited by a single poll. A one outlier poll, that especially if it's sort of concordant with your personal beliefs, if you have a favorite party and one poll says, oh, my favorite party is up by 6%, you're really likely to get excited by this one poll. So maybe give it a few days, wait for another few polls before you interpret things too much. So sort of damp down your expectations of what polls are and what they can do. About sampling voters, really important to if you want to give people a good sense of what's actually going on, report undecided voters clearly and prominently. One thing I've noticed, especially in Canadian polling, it happens in the U.S. as well, is that undecided voter number is either hidden somewhere in the fine print, which most people aren't going to notice, or you have to figure it out from likely voter sample sizes, dividing that by the total voter sample sizes. And it's not really a good practice, I don't think. I mean, it makes the poll look more exciting, but if there really are 25 or 35% of voters who are undecided, it's really important to put that down because it gives people the idea that lots of change could happen, as opposed to an election where only 5% of voters are undecided, where you could say, okay, maybe the polls are a little bit more reliable. And the reason to do this is that you shouldn't assume that undecided voters are the same as decided voters, because in many, many cases they're not. They're often, many times, they're close enough that the assumption that they are the same is okay, but there are some prominent examples of where they haven't. And finally, about voters misrepresenting their preferences. Likely voter models are often skewed by the fact that people do misrepresent these preferences, so be really careful when designing them. Don't just rely on polling data to generate your likely voter models. And finally, there are regular contexts, especially elections where you're going to throw out an incumbent government, or where perhaps a candidate from a social demographic group that has been classically underrepresented is running for the first time. That these are contexts in which voters are more likely to end up telling you something that doesn't end up being true. So if you're polling people in a context of an election like this, make sure to make it as comfortable as possible for them to tell you what they're actually thinking if you want to get a good result. And otherwise, just be aware that this happens and make sure to take that into account when you're writing up results like that. So that should bring us into about 20 minutes, and luckily brings us to the last slide here, and I'm happy to entertain any questions as they appear.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. That was really interesting to hear about how people have been misrepresenting their votes in the past. I do have some questions. I'm looking at one that specifically references something you said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
They're asking about evidence that people report intending to vote for one party but vote for another, just as you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And now it kind of makes me think about what's possibly happening in the U.S. with Trump. So he might be seen as having certain social desirability issues going on.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts in terms of people saying they want to vote for him or don't want to vote for him, in terms of then following up and what they actually do?
Yeah, I mean, in all sorts of ways. Obviously, if you've been following along, Donald Trump is a huge wild card, and I think he's also one in the context of polling. So there may be two things that will be going on. One is that in some communities, Donald Trump will be really popular. So in those communities, the context would say that if you don't like Donald Trump, you might end up telling a pollster that you do because you want to sort of fit in. But in a lot of contexts, and there were some really interesting anonymous interviews with Trump voters, especially in large, demographically diverse cities, where people say, I am a Donald Trump supporter, but I can't tell anybody that because they would be angry at me. There was an interesting one about a man who hadn't even told his wife that he was supporting Donald Trump because he was afraid of being judged. So when you have a candidate who is controversial, especially in the way that Donald Trump has been controversial, the reliability of the response from people being surveyed is higher than average, almost certainly.
Interesting. All right, got another question here. Chris is asking, why do polling firms not use prediction markets methods when research has shown it's accurate and doesn't have the same sampling issues that a lot of surveys have?
Well, I guess I'm not exactly sure why the firms themselves don't, but I mean, it is true that these market-based models tend to perform as well or sometimes better than surveys. But one thing that we know as well is that in a market-based model, the people who are participating in the market are using inputs that they're reading about from the campaign, so they can use some qualitative inputs. Maybe if you're an experienced watcher of campaigns, you can see if a campaign is going well or not. But another thing that they're using is polls as well. So you end up with a really big feedback loop where polls could use market-based models, but also market-based models are people participating in market-based models are definitely using polls as an input for their own decision-making as well. So with huge polling failures, like in Alberta, you probably weren't going to find too many prediction markets that were overwhelmingly in favor of the PCs winning, just because the polls were so different from that as the result.
Got another question. Given the unpredictability of polling, what do you see as the appropriate role for this type of research?
Well, I mean, some people feel that public polling shouldn't be done at all because it skews voters. But at the same time, I mean, I disagree. I mean, one, just because I'm a big political nerd, if you haven't noticed, and polling is essentially our drug of choice. But at the same time, I think that it's important to let people know how a campaign is going, and not just for interest, but because, like, say, in a first past the post system like we have, where you win a seat if you win the most votes, regardless of what that percentage is. It's important to know where various parties are standing, so you can make a choice based on that. So I think that public polling has a really important role to play, but I think that the role could be improved or made more effective if polls are reported in a way that's sort of a little bit more responsible about reporting things like the percentage of undecided voters.
Okay, another question here. You mentioned you used gamification for some of your past predictions. Is this something you plan to do for the USA?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I've been sort of toying with the idea. I mean, I've just been busy in March, essentially, but there's lots of time till November. So I mean, there's certainly a good role for things like Monte Carlo simulations in projecting the U.S. election. The U.S. election is actually quite a good one to do that on because there's so much more polling than compared to Canada. And also there's polling about individual states, whereas in Canada you get almost no polls about individual ridings. So it ends up being actually a little bit simpler and a little bit easier to predict the result.
You say easy.
Yeah, well, yeah, easier.
Another question, how do we convince people that our research is good when the poll results are so bad?
Well, so there are a couple of approaches that can be taken, certainly. I mean, one is to make sure not to do any of the cheap and easy methods. It's important to sample correctly and all of this sort of thing. But it's also, I think that giving people more context to a poll, especially in like the little PDFs that are released with public polls, if you give people more context about how to interpret and give people more tools about how to interpret the results, I think that even in situations of polling failures, people will understand that this is, you know, sometimes there are sampling problems that are beyond the sampling control of, or sampling error beyond the control of the surveyor. But if you also give people the idea that, oh, look, there is 25% of people who are undecided, or, you know, we're 3 weeks away from the election, there's lots of time for people to change their minds. If you give people these sort of, on one hand, statistical tools to interpret the information, but also give them sort of you know, like softer, you know, I'll sell political science here for a second, sort of political sciencey type concepts and tools about, you know, voter decision-making processes, then it can give people more confidence in the results, as opposed to just saying, oh, look, this is a breaking news, we have an amazing new poll that you're going to love to look at. Just sort of selling it from a sort of an entertainment perspective will reduce people's confidence in it, I think, if it's wrong. Whereas if you give people political context and you give people statistical knowledge and the ability to interpret the results for themselves, then I think that people will have more confidence in public polls.
Okay. One last question. How would you respond to the allegation that Vetmakers are more accurate than polls since they are actually betting their money?
Yeah, so I mean, I wonder about that in the grand context. That if, for instance, if either existed in a vacuum, you almost certainly wouldn't see a difference, because I mean, it's not like the people who are gambling their own money, and I mean, sure, it sort of ups the stakes a little bit, but you're using polls as a major source of your predictive models. There are almost no reliable, in a general context, models to predict elections that don't use some sort of public opinion input. I mean, there are some economic models that do so, but the more you think about them, the more sort of problematic they become. So I don't think that the success of markets is just about the superiority of markets. It's about the fact that market-based approaches for predicting elections use public opinion polls as an input, but they also use other things as well. So I mean, should pollsters just wholesale abandon their own methods and shift over to market-based approaches? Probably not, just because there's sort of it's a interconnected system that's going on here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. We've reached the end of our time today, but everyone, do feel free to email or link or tweet with Paul or myself. I'm happy to pass any of your questions over to Paul, and you can get a much more in-depth answer from him. Paul, thanks so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
So everyone, have a great day, and may your data be as error-free as you can possibly get it. Goodbye, everyone.